This started in, excuse my pronunciation, Miletus, with the first planned city in the world, arguably, which was 2,500 years ago on the coast of Turkey. But what it is a simple projection of what is publicly held, public streets, public rights of way, and public places. And it made a thing called very small blocks, or islands, as we sometimes call them in Turkey. Now, it created an environment within which we could do anything that we wanted to do in terms of development, moving through the city, etc. But over the years, especially over the last 100 years, we have changed the way we think about cities. And so now, we look at a site like this, and we think, what can that be? When in fact, that site is 11 New York City blocks. And it's important to understand that when we build blocks of this size, we create an adaptable, walkable, sustainable community. And so it has to do with the way we perceive of ourselves in the city. And so think about the difference between being in Para and being in some of the new suburban developments in Istanbul or other parts of the world. It's a very different experience. And so this is just a diagram that describes the difference in New York between walking across town with longer blocks and walking uptown with shorter blocks. So it's very similar to the idea of walking up and down Ishikawa Street, right? Or walking through Para, where you think you're moving much more quickly than if you're in larger, more disconnected areas. And this will have an importance on the way that we think about cities. So we look at the size of blocks in high-functioning cities like Istanbul. Please remember that the Empire State Building, the largest building in the world for half a century, was on a block that was essentially 60 meters, or a lot that was 60 meters by 100 meters. 60 meters by 100 meters held the largest building in the world in the 20th century. But this is what's happened. We have very interesting cities with all kinds of great things and all kinds of ways to move through them. We move the bad stuff out because we don't want people to be unhealthy. But then we decided we didn't want to live in the city, so we moved the houses out. Then we decided we didn't want to live with people who made different amounts of money, so we organized neighborhoods based on prices, based on class. Then we got rid of every kind of transportation other than cars. So if you spent 2 hours crossing the second bridge or the first bridge, you know exactly what I mean. Then we connected everything with highways. And if you think about the primary way that we move through urban areas today, it is all about planned highways, about capacity, and about moving large volume of vehicles. You know it doesn't work. I will tell you that most of this, the engineering for it, is based on less than scientific methodologies. And what we end up with is declining urban areas. But they're starting to come back. This is a neighborhood called Byron, and it's one of the urban regeneration areas. Now this is critical because remember, in Istanbul, there's a kind of amazing fabric in the city that is slowly being lost. And we have to think about that as we redevelop. And so our idea is that these areas need to be replicable. They need to preserve the neighborhood character, not exactly, but preserve the character. They need to add value because this is the financial mechanism through which redevelopment occurs. And they need to be resilient because remember that these are all based on the idea of creating Istanbul and other cities as more resilient urban areas, both from natural disasters but also economically. So we look at this area, understand the characteristics, create a general relationship of the places, but then we do something very different than what most other groups do. We put in place a street framework. The street framework is the exact same thing that Hippodamus used when he planned Miletus 2,500 years ago. And in fact, was the only way we planned cities for 2,500 years until the middle of the 20th century. And we end up with something like this, which you've all seen many times in many places. We create a series of different kinds of streets because these are important. They're not just about moving cars. They're actually the largest public space we have in every city. And then we start thinking about the different characteristics of open spaces. Now, this is important a bit later, but it has to do again with thinking about parks as both public, but also areas for people that live in individual buildings. And so again, it looks something like this. Now, this is an interesting situation because we have the Vatan Mahalles, excuse my pronunciation, but the Vatan neighborhood and Atashir. And so there are characteristics of Vatan that are very different than Atashir. Atashir has been redeveloped as very big disconnected blocks. So when I drove here from downtown, there were all these new residential developments, but they were big blocks, big islands with no neighborhood, no connectivity. And this is something that's happening around the world. Excuse me. So we look at something like the difference. Now this is really important, right? If you think of one thing and one thing only, the number of intersections in Vatan is 98 in the overall area of the site. If we take the same area and superimpose it over the newly redesigned Atashir, we have 13. So what this does is it tells you that there is no public framework. There's nothing that facilitates and allows the change and refinement of the city over time in a sustainable way. So if I want to change, if I want to change, where did it go? This thing is not working again. Sorry. If I want to change something here, I have to change a giant area. But here, I can change a very small thing when the market changes or other events require change. So again, it's just talking about the way that the form of the neighborhood or the city responds to the way we live and work. So our goal, instead of 13 in this area, is to get at least 57, which is a much tighter development pattern, something that We quickly moved through an analysis of all of the different components to understand how these things work together. To create a logical distribution of the elements. And then, and this is also incredibly important, if you think about the way cities have naturally progressed, they didn't tear everything down and start from scratch. It was an incremental, piece-by-piece process based on certain building typologies. And so you can get the densities, the value, the return for every one of these projects based on very simple building typologies that fit within this block structure. This is an example in Paris, in the 13th arrondissement. Another example of slightly larger buildings. And so we are then setting up a framework for the transformation. Now, this is the existing situation, but we simply moved through, and because we're taking advantage of the situation of the existing streets and not getting rid of them, not starting from scratch, we can leave infrastructure in, and we can incrementally develop in a much more logical way than starting from scratch. But it also allows you to change uses. And so the way we plan in the world today is we start with uses. We're going to have some residential, we're going to have some office, we're going to have some college, university, but that's not the way cities grew previously. It's something we made up in the 1920s and 30s. And so these are simply showing different scenarios with this block framework in place that allow for the redistribution of uses. This is a very fundamental change in the way we plan. If you look at every comprehensive plan in the world, it starts with where uses go in the city, which is telling you how to build the city with the least permanent thing. It changes continually. It is absolutely crazy. I don't know how this is translating. Again, just images. And so then we have to figure out how to regulate for this, how to write the guidelines. And so this is another project that we're working on. And again, excuse my translation, but Gassion Montpassa. And it's putting in place the guidelines for the way that we would do this. And so this is taking an existing area and describing the intention and the goals for block and street distribution. Right? We want them to be very flexible, very developable, but also very walkable and very as small as possible. Okay, I think I'm pointing in the wrong direction. And so we actually project where these things go. Remember, the streets are the most permanent parts of cities, so they should always be the first things that we lay out. And then we have development blocks that, or development areas that move into these. And then we think about the public spaces, right? And the public spaces are very clearly delineated as parks and streets, right? Not private elements. And then the street types, again, just very simple, clear delineations of the way this works. And then building types. And so we test all of this with very complex algorithms that are based on programs that we've set up to ensure that you can get the kind of development that you would want. Now, I'll say something interesting about this. We've also begun to superimpose the idea of pedestrian connectivity. So even where we've got slightly larger blocks, we can allow developers to come in and create internal spaces as they might want to. And this, in a city like Istanbul, especially with densities, the more connections you can get, the better. It also solves a problem of having private courtyards And so then you simply superimpose heights, which is always an issue of Istanbul in a very simple way. But what you ultimately get to is something that is a very, very simple projected framework of streets that is then tested to make sure that the buildings can work, and then you put in where the uses go, and the uses can change very easily. Now, I will say that in the end of this, the work that we got back from the municipality required that we take streets out, because there's this idea that bigger islands are more flexible, which is absolutely untrue. And so if you think about Manhattan, about New York, it has some of the smallest blocks in the world, yet it's the most flexible system you could possibly imagine for a city. So we're doing things to get to certain points, but we're actually making decisions that get us further from where we're trying to go. And so the municipality came back and took a bunch of our streets out and said, you can't have those streets because it reduces flexibility, so we had to then superimpose private streets that would get used like public streets that would create the same framework. It's hard for me to explain the impact that this has, but it's impacting, because I work with